Naomi Adeyemi ran like her entire life depended on it. Because right now it did. Her sneakers slapped against the polished floors of Incheon International Airport, her carry-on bag abandoned somewhere behind her, near the check-in counters. Her braids flying wildly behind her, as she dodged trolleys, elderly couples, and a group of confused Japanese tourists who scattered the moment she came barreling through them. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not when she could see the back of his head, that familiar dark hair, those broad shoulders, that stiff, heartbreakingly rigid posture that she had spent 4 months learning to soften. "Ethan!" she screamed. "Kim Ethan, don't you dare!" He didn't turn around. She ran faster. The departure board above her flashed. Seoul Incheon to New York. JOFK. Final boarding. Gate 47. Her chest tightened. She pushed past a businessman on a phone call, nearly collided with a cart full of luggage, and kept running. Her heart was slamming so hard against her ribs she could feel it in her throat. 4 months. It had taken 4 months for him to become the person she couldn't imagine a single morning without. And now he was about to disappear through a gate, onto a plane, and out of her life entirely. As if none of it had happened. As if she had imagined all of it. She hadn't imagined it. She knew she hadn't. "Ethan, please." He stopped. His shoulders rose slowly, like a man bracing for something he'd already decided he wouldn't survive. He turned around, and the moment Naomi saw his face, that sharp jaw, those dark eyes, the way he was pressing his lips together so tightly they'd gone pale. She felt her legs nearly give out beneath her. She slowed to a stop just a few feet away from him, breathing hard, pressing one hand to her sternum like she could physically hold her heart in place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The airport moved around them like a river parting for 2 stones. Announcements blared in Korean, English, and Japanese. Somewhere behind Naomi, a child was crying. Somewhere ahead, a gate was closing. "You weren't supposed to find out," Ethan said quietly. His voice was low, controlled, the way it always got when he was feeling the most. "You weren't supposed to leave," Naomi said back. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, and something behind his eyes shifted. Something that looked dangerous. Something that looked like it wanted to stay. Then he turned back toward the gate, and Naomi thought, "No, absolutely not. But before we go back to that moment, if this is your first time here, welcome to Afro-Seoul TV by Chris. We tell love stories here, the complicated kind. The kind with real wounds and slow healing and people who almost miss each other. Subscribe, turn on your notifications, and give this video a like. Because every story we tell deserves an audience that actually feels it. Now, back to Seoul, back to the airport, back to everything that led to this moment. 4 months earlier, Naomi Adeyemi had arrived in Seoul with 2 oversized suitcases, a carry-on that was technically too heavy but that she'd charmed her way through at Lagos Airport. 4 months of savings, a teaching contract that started in 3 weeks, and absolutely nowhere to live. She was 27 years old, and this was either the bravest thing she had ever done, or the most catastrophically stupid. She genuinely wasn't sure which. Seoul in early spring was cold in a way that felt personal, the kind of cold that slipped through your jacket and directly into your confidence. She stood outside Gimpo Airport with her 2 suitcases and her phone open to a rental app that kept refreshing without loading, and she told herself firmly that she was fine. She was fine. She had navigated worse than this. She had survived her mother's commentary on every single life decision she'd ever made. She had survived the Lagos traffic during the rainy season. She had survived a university roommate who microwaved fish at midnight. She could survive in Seoul. What she had not been prepared to survive was the housing market. 3 days she spent in a guest house that smelled of mildew and broken promises, sending inquiries on every rental platform she could find. Most didn't respond. One responded in Korean so formal, she needed 3 translation apps to understand it. And the answer was no. Another place looked perfect. In the photos, cozy, warm lit, near the subway, and turned out to be a closet with aspirations. She was running out of time and out of options when she saw the listing. Second-floor apartment, Mapo-gu. 5 minutes from line 6, private entrance, quiet building, landlord on premises. The photos were clean and minimal. White walls, wooden floors, a small balcony with a view of a street lined with bare-branched trees that would probably be beautiful in 3 weeks when spring actually arrived. The price was reasonable, almost suspiciously reasonable. There was a single line at the bottom of the listing that she almost scrolled past. Serious tenants only, no disruptions, no visitors past 9 p.m., no exceptions. Naomi stared at that line for a full 30 seconds. Then she sent an inquiry anyway. She did not expect a response within 11 minutes. She especially did not expect the response to be, "Available to view at 4 p.m. today, if you are serious. Address below. Do not be late." She was 7 minutes early. The building was a slim 4-story structure tucked between a convenience store and a small laundry shop on a quiet side street. It was the kind of building that didn't announce itself. No decorative facade, no potted plants outside, just clean lines and a dark front door with a silver keypad. Naomi stood in front of it, with her hands in her coat pockets, and her best "I am a responsible adult" expression ready to deploy. The door opened before she knocked. The man standing in the doorway was not what she had pictured when she imagined a landlord named from an online listing. She had pictured someone middle-aged, a little distracted, maybe holding a clipboard. She had not pictured someone who looked like he had walked directly off the set of a Korean thriller. Tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of structured jaw that looked like it had been designed with specific intent. Wearing a plain dark sweater and dark trousers, and looking at her with an expression that could generously be described as neutral, and less generously described as deeply unwelcoming. "You're early," he said. "You said don't be late," Naomi replied. "Early is the safe side of not late." He looked at her for a moment. "Kim Ethan," he said. "I own the building." "Naomi Adeyemi," she said. "I need somewhere to live." He stepped back to let her in without smiling, without any of the small social warmth that Naomi was accustomed to from every person she had ever met in her entire life. She followed him up a narrow staircase to the second floor, where he unlocked the apartment door and pushed it open and stood to the side to let her enter first. It was perfect. She didn't say that out loud. She walked through the space slowly, professionally, the way she imagined a person who had many housing options would walk. Wooden floors that were actually warm underfoot, a kitchen with enough counter space to do real cooking, a bathroom that was clean and bright. The balcony was small but real, a sliding glass door that opened to just enough outdoor space to stand in and breathe and feel like you hadn't entirely traded the sky for a ceiling. "I'll take it," she said. "You haven't heard the rules," Ethan said from the doorway. "There were rules in the listing. Those were the previews." He produced a single folded sheet of paper from his pocket and held it out. Naomi unfolded it. It was typed, single-spaced. It was also genuinely quite long for a piece of paper about an apartment. No loud music past 8 p.m. No cooking smells that travel to the hallway. Use the ventilation fan. No guests who stay past 9 p.m. No rearranging the furniture without permission. Garbage separated according to Seoul metropolitan standards. A guide is posted inside the kitchen cabinet. No deliveries accepted by the landlord on the tenant's behalf. Report any maintenance issues within 24 hours. No noise in the stairwell past 10 p.m. Naomi looked up from the paper. "Is this negotiable?" "No," said Ethan. "The 9 p.m. guest rule." "No." "I was going to ask if 9:30 was." "No." Naomi looked at him. He looked back at her with the absolute calm of a man who had decided exactly how this conversation would go, and was not particularly interested in alternative outcomes. She looked back down at the paper. She thought about the mildew guest house. She thought about the closet with aspirations. She folded the paper neatly and put it in her coat pocket. "Okay," she said. When can I move in? Something moved across his face, so brief she almost missed it. Not quite surprise. Something closer to recalculation. Saturday, he said. Perfect, said Naomi. She moved in on Saturday. It took her 2 trips from the guest house to the new apartment because she refused to pay for a taxi for a third. Ethan was in the building when she arrived, carrying things up the stairs herself, and he watched her struggle with the larger suitcase for approximately 45 seconds before he came and took it from her without a word and carried it up the flight of stairs with the ease of someone who found the effort mildly inconvenient. "Thank you," she said, slightly breathless. "It was slowing down the stairwell," he said, and went back to his apartment on the ground floor. Naomi stood in her new living room with her suitcases around her and the afternoon light coming through the balcony door, and she laughed, quietly, to herself, because she had no idea what to make of Kim Ethan, and she had a feeling that figuring him out was going to be the most interesting project she had taken on in years. She was not wrong. The first week, they existed in careful parallel. She learned his patterns without meaning to. The way he left the building every morning at exactly 7:43 a.m. The way he returned in the early evening carrying a single grocery bag that always seemed to contain almost but not quite enough food for someone to actually be satisfied. She heard him in the kitchen below her, late at night sometimes, the sound of water running, the occasional clatter of something being set on a counter. He was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like someone who had trained himself to take up as little space as possible. She, on the other hand, had never in her life successfully taken up less space than she intended. The first real conversation happened because of jollof rice. Naomi had been in the apartment for 9 days when she decided that she had earned the right to cook a proper meal. Not the careful, odorless, landlord-approved meals she had been preparing all week. Rice and simple stews and things that wouldn't travel past the kitchen ventilation fan. No, she wanted jollof, the real kind. The kind her mother made on Sunday afternoons in Lagos, with tomatoes blended fresh and palm oil and the specific smoky bottom that Nigerians argued about, with the kind of passion usually reserved for religion and politics. She bought everything she needed. From an African goods store she found 40 minutes away, by subway, came home with 2 full bags, and started cooking at 6 in the evening, with the fan on full blast and the balcony door open despite the cold. By 7, the entire building smelled like West Africa. She heard the knock on her door at 7:14 p.m. She opened it with a wooden spoon still in her hand and tomato sauce on her wrist, and found Ethan standing in the hallway, looking, for the first time since she had met him, genuinely uncertain. He was not in his usual composed posture. He was standing slightly closer to the wall than usual, as if the smell had physically moved him, and his expression had done something complicated that she couldn't fully read. "The smell," he started. "The fan is on," Naomi said. "The balcony is open. I have done everything short of cooking outside on the street. That's not—" He paused. Something shifted in his face. "What is that?" Naomi blinked. "Jollof rice. Jollof," he repeated, like the word was new in his mouth. "Nigerian jollof rice. It's tomato-based, spiced, cooked until the bottom gets this specific." She stopped herself. He was still looking past her into the apartment, at the pot on the stove, with an expression she now recognized because she had seen it before. On people who ate her mother's food for the first time and didn't yet have the language for what they were feeling. He was hungry, not just physically. Something about the smell had reached him somewhere deeper than his stomach. "Have you eaten?" she asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked back at her quickly, composure reassembling itself. "I was going to, because I made enough for 8 people, Naomi said. "Which is a problem I have every single time I cook, because my mother taught me that cooking small is a character flaw." A pause. The fan hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed. "The rules say no," he began. "You're "The landlord," Naomi said. "You're allowed in your own building after 9 p.m. That rule is for guests, not you." She turned back toward the kitchen. "Sit down if you're sitting. The rice needs 5 more minutes." She heard after a moment the sound of him stepping into the apartment. He sat at her small dining table with the stiff, careful posture of someone attending a formal event they hadn't been briefed on. Naomi set a plate in front of him. Jollof rice, fried plantains she'd found at the African store, a simple chicken stew, and sat across from him with her own plate and watched him take the first bite with the focused neutrality of a man who had committed to not having any reaction whatsoever. He had a reaction. It was small, just a fractional shift in his expression, a brief closing of his eyes. But Naomi had been raised by a woman who read people the way other people read books, and she caught every word of it. "It's good," he said, in a tone that suggested good was doing significant heavy lifting. "You can say it's very good," Naomi told him. "I won't tell anyone." He looked at her. "It's very good," he said, quietly, like a concession. Naomi smiled into her plate. "My mother would be glad to hear it." They ate in silence for a while, but it was a different kind of silence than the careful parallel they had been maintaining all week. It was the kind of silence that happens between two people who are both listening carefully to each other, without either of them speaking. Naomi had always been comfortable with silence. Growing up in a house with 4 siblings had taught her that silence was a gift, not a void that needed filling. But she was also curious, in a way that she had never quite been able to switch off. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. "In Seoul." He considered. "My whole life, except for 3 years in New York." "New York," she repeated. "What were you doing there?" "Architecture firm. I came back when—" He stopped, set his chopsticks down, picked them back up. "When things changed." Naomi didn't push. She had learned early that the things people didn't finish saying were usually the things that mattered most, and that the fastest way to get someone to close completely was to reach for those things too quickly. So instead she said, "I've never been to New York. I went to London once for a conference. The weather made me feel personally attacked." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The precursor to one. "Seoul winters are worse," he said. "I'm starting to understand that," Naomi said. "I wore 3 layers today and still felt like the wind had opinions about me." This time the corner of his mouth moved further. A real smile. Brief, slightly surprised at itself, like it had shown up without permission. He caught it quickly and put his neutral expression back in place. But Naomi had already seen it, and she filed it away with the same careful attention she gave everything important. After dinner, he helped her wash the dishes without being asked. He dried them with the methodical focus of someone who found order in small tasks, stacking everything precisely. And when he was done, he folded the dish towel into a neat rectangle and set it on the counter and said, "Thank you for the food." "Come back when I cook a goosey," Naomi said. "It'll change your life." He looked at her for a moment, that unreadable dark gaze, and then he said, "Good night, Ms. Adeyemi," and let himself out. Naomi stood in her kitchen for a moment after the door closed, listening to his footsteps go down the stairs, and thought, there is an entire world behind that face, and he has locked every door and swallowed every key. She also thought. He smiled. Twice. She was going to consider that a victory. The cultural collision moments came fast after that, and they came with a specific, delightful chaos that Naomi could not have scripted if she tried. There was the morning she came downstairs and found Ethan in the small shared lobby area, attempting, with the rigid, determined focus of a man who considered failure a personal insult, to explain to a delivery driver in Korean that the package was not his and he did not know who had ordered it, while the package in question was very clearly addressed to Naomi Adeyemi, in letters large enough to read from the street. Naomi had been behind him for almost 30 seconds before she said, "That's mine. I ordered Puff Puff Mix from an online African store." She reached past him and signed for it. The delivery driver left. Ethan turned and looked at the box, then at her. "Puff Puff," he said. "It's a fried dough snack," she said. "It's perfect. You'll understand when you eat one." "You had it delivered here." "I live here," Naomi said pleasantly, and went back upstairs with her box. She made Puff Puff that Saturday and left a plate outside his door. The plate was empty when she retrieved it 2 hours later. He did not say anything about it directly, but when they passed in the stairwell that afternoon, he gave her a look that communicated, with impressive economy, that he had eaten every single one and was not going to acknowledge this, but also was not opposed to a future in which it happened again. She understood him completely. Then there was the afternoon she decided to learn how to make kimchi jjigae from a YouTube video and called Ethan through the floor to ask him what gochugaru meant on the ingredients list because her translation app was giving her 3 different answers. He came upstairs, stood in her kitchen doorway, looked at her setup. Laptop propped open, 4 different ingredients on the counter, 1 pot already showing signs of distress, and said, in the tone of a man watching a situation deteriorate in real time, "What are you doing?" "I'm making kimchi jjigae," Naomi said. "You put too much water," he said. "The video said 2 cups. That is not what 2 cups of that looks like." He came to the stove without being invited, turned down the heat and said, "Where is your kimchi?" "In the fridge. I bought it from the mart near the subway." He looked at the brand when she brought it out. He made a face so subtle and specific that Naomi burst out laughing because she could read exactly what it meant. This was not his preferred brand. This was an acceptable brand. He had opinions about this and was choosing, with great restraint, not to share all of them. "It'll work," he said, which was clearly the diplomatic version of something more detailed. He ended up staying for 45 minutes, guiding her through the rest of the recipe, with the quiet precision of someone who had been making this dish since childhood and had specific opinions about every step. He tasted the broth twice, adjusted the seasoning both times without asking, and at one point said, "Your instinct for heat is too aggressive," to which Naomi said, "I'm Nigerian, Ethan. Everything is an occasion for more pepper." And he looked at her, and she looked at him, and they were standing close enough in her small kitchen that she could see the specific shade of dark brown in his eyes and the way one edge of his jaw tightened slightly when he was thinking, and she thought, "Oh." She took a half step back and focused very intently on the stew. They ate at her table again that evening, and the evening after that, and the one after that. It didn't announce itself, the shift. That was the thing about it. It arrived the way spring arrived in Seoul, gradual and then suddenly undeniable. One morning, Naomi noticed that she had started timing her morning coffee to when she heard his door, and she was outside on the balcony with her mug when he left at 7:43 a.m., and he looked up at her as he always did, that quick assessing glance. But this time he paused on the street below and said, "It's going to rain at noon. Take an umbrella." She hadn't taken an umbrella. It rained at noon. She was standing outside the school where she taught, absolutely soaked, laughing to herself in the way that only happens when you're embarrassed and thrilled in equal measure, when her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "There's a convenience store on the corner of your street. They sell umbrellas." She had texted back, "I survived." He had replied after a pause, "Barely, I'd guess." She had stood in the rain holding her phone and read that message 3 times and felt something warm move through her chest that had nothing whatsoever to do with the temperature. Inside, quietly, something had already begun. The fever happened on a Tuesday. Naomi had felt it coming since Sunday. That specific heaviness behind the eyes, the way sounds started arriving slightly too loud, the way her bones began quietly registering complaints about everything she asked them to do. She had ignored it with the practiced determination of someone raised by a mother who believed that illness was largely a matter of insufficient willpower, and she had gone to work Monday and taught 3 full classes, and come home and made herself a cup of tea and told herself firmly that she was fine. By Tuesday morning, she could not get out of bed. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way, in the quiet, humiliating way where you genuinely intend to stand up and your body simply declines to participate, and you lie there staring at the ceiling, feeling betrayed by every system you had previously trusted to function. Her temperature was 38.9. Her throat felt like she had swallowed something with ambitions. Her phone was on the other side of the bed, and that distance felt, at that moment, genuinely unreasonable. She texted the school. She texted her friend Amara back in Lagos, who would call immediately and say exactly the right things in exactly the wrong order, which was somehow comforting. Then she lay back and closed her eyes and decided that this was fine. She was in her apartment. She had water. She was a grown adult woman who had navigated considerably worse than a fever. She did not text Ethan. She didn't know when he found out. She became aware of him the way you become aware of things when your fever is high enough that the boundary between sleeping and waking gets soft and unreliable. She heard the door, thought she had imagined it, then heard the quiet, specific sound of someone moving in her kitchen with the careful deliberateness of a person who does not want to disturb anything. She opened her eyes. The light in the apartment had changed. Afternoon, maybe, or later. She wasn't sure. Ethan was in her doorway holding a bowl of something that was steaming. She stared at him. He looked back at her with his customary neutral expression. But there was something underneath it that she was too feverish to name precisely. A tightness around his eyes. A quality of attention that felt different from his usual careful observation. "You didn't come down this morning," he said. "I'm sick," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "I know." He came into the room and set the bowl on the small nightstand beside her bed. It was miyeokguk, seaweed soup, the kind Korean mothers made when someone was unwell, simple and clean and warm. There was also a glass of water, and beside it 2 tablets of something he'd clearly pulled from his own medicine cabinet. "Eat if you can. The tablets are for the fever." Naomi looked at the soup. She looked at him. Something about the scene. Him standing in her bedroom doorway with soup he had made without being asked, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, looking at her with that carefully controlled expression that was failing, right at the edges, to fully conceal that he was worried, made her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the illness. "You made me soup," she said. "Don't make it significant," he said immediately. "Kim Ethan," she said, "you made me soup." "You're a tenant. If you become seriously ill, there are administrative complications." "That is the least convincing thing you have ever said to me." Something moved through his expression. That brief, involuntary thing that happened when she caught him being human and he hadn't finished constructing the wall in time. He looked away, toward the balcony door. "Eat the soup while it's warm," he said. "I'll check on you later." "You don't have to," she started. "I know," he said, and left. She ate the soup. It was perfect. Simple and precise, seasoned with the light touch of someone who knew exactly how much was enough. She took the tablets. She slept. When she woke up, the bowl had been quietly removed from the nightstand and replaced with a fresh glass of water and a small plate of crackers. She lay in the fading afternoon light and listened to the building around her. His movements below careful and quiet, the sound of water, the distant sound of something being set on a counter, and felt in the particular vulnerability of being sick and far from home, an overwhelming gratitude that she was here and not somewhere else, in some other apartment with some other landlord who left notes about garbage separation and nothing else. He came back at 7 with more soup and a different kind. This time a simple chicken broth with rice, softer, easier. He sat in the chair near her desk while she ate, not talking, not demanding anything from the silence, just present in the way that some people are present, not filling the space but not abandoning it either. She finished half the bowl and set it down and looked at him. "Tell me something," she said, "about yourself. Anything." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because I'm sick and I'm far from home and I need to hear a voice that isn't my own thoughts." She paused. "And because you know things about me now. You've seen my kitchen chaos and my terrible umbrella decisions and my fever face, which I'm told is alarming. And I know almost nothing about you." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I used to draw buildings before I studied them." She waited. "When I was a child," he continued slowly, as if each word was being carefully authorized before release, "I used to draw buildings in notebooks. Not real buildings, imaginary ones. Houses with rooms that didn't make practical sense, staircases that went in directions they shouldn't." A pause. "My sister used to ask me to draw her one, every time. She'd describe what she wanted, big windows, a garden, a room just for reading, and I'd draw it for her." "Used to," Naomi said softly. The silence that followed was a different kind. Heavier, shaped. "Her name was Jion," he said. "She died 4 years ago. Her daughter with her. Car accident." He said it the way people say things they have said before, out loud, in required moments, with a flatness that was the direct result of having learned, through painful repetition, that feeling it fully in public was not something he could afford. "I came back from New York after. There was no reason to stay there." Naomi looked at him across the quiet room. "I'm sorry," she said, not the reflexive version but the real one, slow and full. "I'm really sorry, Ethan." He nodded once, looking at his hands. "The building was hers," he said quietly. Jion always talked about having a building with good neighbors, people who actually knew each other. He almost smiled, but it didn't complete itself. "I bought it 2 years after she died. I don't entirely know why." "I think you do," Naomi said gently. He looked at her. She held his gaze, and in the soft, fever-warm light of the apartment she could see it clearly. The loneliness of him. The specific shape of a person who had suffered a loss so total it had rearranged everything, who had rebuilt himself around the absence and called the result self-sufficiency. She recognized it not because she had experienced the same thing, but because she had been raised by a woman who could read the architecture of a person's pain, and that gift, apparently, had transferred. "You should sleep," he said, standing. "Ethan," she said. He paused. "Thank you. For the soup, for staying." She looked at him steadily. "For telling me about Jion." He stood very still for a moment, like the words had reached somewhere he hadn't expected. Then he said quietly, "Good night, Naomi." And she noticed, she absolutely noticed, that it was the first time he had used her first name. She lay in the dark after he left and pressed her hand flat against her chest and thought, "There you are. There is the person inside all that careful silence." And she thought something else too, something she wasn't quite ready to say out loud yet, even to herself. Something that felt warm and certain and slightly terrifying in the way that true things sometimes do. She was better by Thursday. She came downstairs that morning at 7:40 a.m. and found him in the small lobby checking his mail, and she said, "I owe you soup," and he said, "You don't," and she said, "I do. Saturday. I'm making pepper soup and you are not allowed to argue with me about it." And he looked at her for a moment and then said, "Fine," in the tone of a man who had decided that resistance was structurally unsound. She made the pepper soup on Saturday. He sat at her table and ate 2 full bowls and said with great composure, "This is aggressively spiced." "Yes," said Naomi. "It's very good," he said. "I know," said Naomi. He looked at her. She grinned at him, and then he laughed. A real one, sudden and genuine, the kind that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, and the sound of it filled her small apartment, like light fills a room when someone finally opens a window that has been shut for too long, and Naomi felt it land in her chest, like something irreversible. The rain came, 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening in late April, when Seoul had finally decided to commit fully to spring and the trees on their street had gone extravagantly green overnight. Naomi had been on the balcony watching the clouds come in. She had learned to read Seoul's sky by now, the specific gray that meant business. When the rain started, sudden and heavy and warm in the way that spring rain sometimes is. She didn't go inside. She stood with her hands on the balcony railing and let it come, because there was something about warm rain that she had loved since childhood, since standing in the courtyard of her family's house in Lagos while her mother called from the door, and she pretended not to hear. She heard the sliding door below open. Ethan stepped onto his small ground floor balcony. She could see him just beneath and to the left of hers, looking up at the rain with his hands in his pockets. He saw her immediately. "You're getting soaked," he said. "I know," she said. "I like it." He was quiet, looking up at her. The rain fell between them, soft and persistent. "You're not going inside either," she pointed out. "I was checking something," he said. "In the rain." "Yes." Ethan. A pause. "Yes. What were you checking?" He was quiet for a long moment. The rain intensified briefly, and then softened again. His hair was getting wet. He didn't move. "I was checking," he said finally, slowly, "if you were out here." The words arrived quietly, without drama, the way the most significant things usually do. Naomi looked down at him through the rain and felt her breath adjust. A small, involuntary recalibration, like her body had registered something her mind was still catching up to. "I'm out here," she said softly. "I know," he said. He looked up at her with those dark eyes, rain on his face, hands still in his pockets, everything about him doing the careful, controlled thing he always did. Except his eyes. His eyes were not controlled. His eyes were saying something that his voice hadn't been authorized to say yet. Something full and unguarded and frightening in its honesty. And Naomi held his gaze and felt the warm rain on her shoulders and thought, "We are in serious trouble, both of us, and I'm not sure I want to be saved." "Come inside," he said finally. "You'll get sick again. You'll make me soup again," she said. Something crossed his face, warm and rueful, and almost defeated by itself. "Naomi," he said. "I'm going inside," she said. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night," he said quietly. She went inside. She stood in the middle of her living room, dripping onto the wooden floor with her heart going at a completely unreasonable speed. And she pressed both hands to her face and breathed and thought, "Kim, Ethan, you are going to be the most complicated thing that has ever happened to me." And then she thought, "Good." It was Amara who said it first. Naomi was on a video call with her on a Sunday afternoon in early May, sitting cross-legged on her bed, with her laptop propped on a pillow. And she had been talking, without fully realizing how long she had been talking, about Ethan. About the way he reorganized her bookshelf once without asking, and then looked mildly defensive when she caught him, as if he had been discovered doing something embarrassing, rather than something quietly thoughtful. About the way he had started leaving small things outside her door. A persimmon from the market, because she had mentioned once that she'd never tried one. A folded note with the correct Korean pronunciation of something she'd been mispronouncing for weeks. A single packet of the good ramen brand, because she had been buying the wrong one. About the way he laughed now, not often, but when he did, it was like watching a door open in a house you'd thought was empty. Amara had been listening with her chin in her hand and an expression of profound unsurprise, and when Naomi finally paused for breath, she said, "Naomi, baby, you are absolutely gone for this man." Naomi opened her mouth. "Do not," Amara said, pointing at the screen. "Say, it's not like that. I will end this call." Naomi closed her mouth. "He makes you soup when you're sick," Amara said. "He checks if you're on your balcony in the rain. He leaves you fruit outside your door." She spread her hands. "What exactly are you waiting for?" "He's complicated," Naomi said. "All the good ones are. He has walls, Amara, real ones, not the decorative kind that come down after 2 conversations, the kind built after real loss. And you have been taking them down brick by brick for 2 months, Amara said. "I can hear it in your voice when you talk about him. You don't talk about anything else the way you talk about him." She paused. "Does he feel the same?" Naomi thought about the rain, about dark eyes saying things his voice hadn't yet been permitted to say. "I think so," she said quietly. "I think he's trying to figure out if he's allowed to." Amara looked at her through the screen with the specific tenderness of someone who has known you long enough to see you clearly. "Then maybe," she said, "someone needs to show him that he is." She was thinking about that conversation 4 days later, when she came home from school on a Thursday evening and found a woman standing in the lobby of the building. She was Korean, elegant in the effortless way of someone who had never had to try very hard at it. Long dark hair, a cream coat, the kind of poise that occupied space quietly but completely. She was holding a small overnight bag and looking at Ethan's door with an expression that Naomi couldn't read from the staircase landing, but which had the quality of something practiced, something that had been composed carefully before arrival. Naomi slowed on the stairs. The woman turned at the sound of her footsteps and looked up. She had sharp, beautiful features and eyes that assessed the situation with quick, precise intelligence. She looked at Naomi, at her braids, her school bag, her coat, with an expression that was entirely pleasant on the surface and something considerably more complicated underneath. "Hello," the woman said, in careful English. "Are you the tenant? 2nd floor?" "Yes," Naomi said. "I'm C.O. Yaren," the woman said. "I'm a friend of Ethan's." A small pause before friend that Naomi's body registered before her mind did. "I'm here to see him. He's expecting me," Naomi said. "I see," in a voice that she was proud of because it sounded completely normal, and she went upstairs to her apartment and closed the door and stood with her back against it in her coat and her school bag and told herself that this meant nothing, because she didn't know who this woman was or what she was to Ethan, or why the pause before the word friend had felt like a hand pressing directly on a bruise she hadn't known she had. She heard Ethan's door open below, heard his voice, the sound of it, not the words. Heard another voice, female, warm, the specific warmth of familiarity. Heard the door close. She stood in her living room for a long time. She made tea she didn't drink. She tried to grade student worksheets and read the same sentence 4 times without it entering her mind. At 9 o'clock she heard his door again, heard the sound of the building's front door, and heard nothing more after that. At 10 she went to bed and lay in the dark and had a firm, rational conversation with herself about assumptions and evidence and the significant unreliability of feelings as a source of information. It was an excellent conversation. She didn't believe a word of it. She found out the truth the wrong way. It was a Saturday 2 days later, and she had come downstairs to check her mail and found Ethan in the lobby on his phone, speaking in Korean in a low, intent voice, his back to the door. He hadn't heard her come down. She wasn't trying to listen. She was reaching for the mailbox when she caught the word that she recognized from the Korean she had been learning. Dionada, Tionada, to leave, to go away. She froze. She heard it again, New York. Those 2 words existed the same in Korean. And then a date. She caught the numbers, 3 weeks. And then something she didn't understand, spoken in the quiet, final tone of a decision already made. She went back upstairs without her mail. She sat at her kitchen table and tried to organize what she knew into something that made sense and kept failing. He was leaving. He was going back to New York. In 3 weeks. And he hadn't said a word, not one word, through all the soup evenings and the rain and the persimmon left outside her door and the laugh that opened him like a window. He had said nothing. He had let her build something, let her believe something, while already knowing he was going to leave. The knock on her door came that evening at 6, which was when he usually came up now, and she opened it with the particular controlled expression of someone who has decided to be fine and is not yet fine, and is hoping the performance will convince both of them. He looked at her face and immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Come in." He came in. She made tea with the methodical focus of someone giving her hands something to do. He sat at the table and watched her with that careful attention of his and said, "Naomi." "Who is Seo Yeren?" she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out clean and direct, the way things do when you've been holding them at arm's length and your arms get tired. A silence. "Where did you hear that name?" She introduced herself, in the lobby, Thursday evening. Naomi turned from the counter and looked at him. "She said she was your friend," with a pause before the word that told a different story. Ethan was very still. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt exactly. Something older than guilt. Something that looked like a man watching a past he thought he'd outrun arriving at his present. "She was my fiancée," he said. 3 years ago, in New York." The word fiancé landed quietly and rearranged several things simultaneously. "Was," Naomi said. "Was," he confirmed. "We ended it before I came back to Seoul. She wanted to talk. She thinks that He stopped. "It's complicated. Most things with you are," Naomi said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and didn't pull it back, because she was tired, suddenly, of being careful. She was tired of reading between lines and waiting for permissions and standing in the rain, hoping that dark eyes meant what she thought they meant. "Are you leaving, Ethan?" The question hit the room like something physical. His jaw tightened. "You heard me on the phone. Are you leaving?" she asked again. He stood up from the table, went to the balcony door, and stood facing it, his back to her, his hands at his sides. Outside, Seoul was doing its evening thing. The lights coming on in the buildings across the street, the sound of traffic, the smell of something being grilled at the Pojangmatcha around the corner. The city going on, entirely unbothered by the conversation in this apartment. "I've been offered a position," he said. "Architecture firm, New York. He paused. "It's a significant opportunity." "When were you going to tell me?" Naomi asked. "I was going to tell you." "When, Ethan?" He turned around. His face was doing the thing it did when he was feeling too much and had run out of room to contain it. The jaw tight, the eyes too direct. The composed surface starting to show the effort it was costing him. "I don't know," he said, and it came out rougher than anything she had ever heard from him. "I don't know, Naomi. Because every time I thought about telling you, He stopped. "You what?" she said quietly. "I couldn't." The 2 words arrived like something being put down after carrying it too long. "I couldn't say it." Naomi looked at him across the kitchen and felt the full complexity of what was happening in her chest. The hurt and the longing and the frustration, and underneath all of it, deep and inconvenient and completely unavoidable, the specific tenderness of a person looking at someone they care about and seeing exactly how frightened they are. She saw it. She saw him. The man who had lost his sister and his grief had hollowed him, and he had rebuilt himself around the emptiness and called it strength. The man who had bought a building in his dead sister's memory and filled it with rules because rules were something you could control and love was something you could not. The man who had let her in incrementally and reluctantly and then completely, and was now standing in her kitchen looking at her with the eyes of someone who genuinely did not know what to do with what he felt, because every time he had loved something, it had eventually required him to survive, losing it. She understood him so completely in that moment that it almost undid her. "Everyone leaves you," she said softly. Not accusatory, just true. He looked at her sharply. "That's what you believe," she said. "That's the thing underneath everything. Jion left, Yeren left, or you left, but it happened. And so you've decided that the safest thing is to be the one who leaves first." She took a breath. "And now you're going to go to New York and you're going to tell yourself it was about the job." "Don't," he said, very quietly. "I'm not angry at you," she said. She pressed her hand flat against the kitchen counter. "I'm telling you that I see it, that I see you, and that whatever you decide, I need you to know that it wasn't nothing. What happened here, whatever this was, it was not nothing." Something cracked in his expression, clean and visible and devastating. "Naomi," he started. "I think," she said, and her voice was steady. She was proud of it. She would be proud of it later when she replayed this. "That you should go. For tonight." She met his gaze. "I think I need to not be in the same room as you right now." He looked at her for a long, wordless moment. Then he walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. Didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," he said, low and real and entirely insufficient and absolutely genuine. "I know," she said. He left. Naomi stood in her kitchen alone and listened to his footsteps go down the stairs, and this time they sounded different. Heavier, slower, like a man carrying something, rather than simply walking. And she put both hands over her face and let herself feel the full weight of it, all of it, in the privacy of her own apartment, where no one could see her, and she didn't have to be composed for anyone. She cried, but only briefly, because she was her mother's daughter and her mother had raised her to feel things fully and then decide what to do with them. She wiped her face. She stood at the balcony door and looked out at Seoul, doing its indifferent evening glittering, and she thought about what Amara had said. Someone needs to show him that he's allowed. And she thought about dark eyes in the rain and soup on a nightstand and a laugh like a window opening and a persimmon left outside her door because she mentioned once casually that she'd never tried one. She thought, "I am not done." She thought, "Neither is he." She picked up her phone. She didn't call him that night. She almost did. 3 times she picked up her phone. Twice she opened his contact. Once she actually pressed call and then ended it before the first ring completed, because she understood, in the quiet of her apartment with Seoul glittering outside her balcony door, that a phone call was not what this moment required. What this moment required was time. Not much, but enough for both of them to sit inside what had happened and feel the full shape of it without the noise of immediate reaction covering everything over. She gave them both the night. In the morning, she came downstairs at 7:40 and stood in the lobby and waited. 7:43 came and went. The front door didn't open. She waited another 5 minutes, telling herself she wasn't waiting, and then went back upstairs and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table and listened to the building. His apartment was silent. She told herself this meant nothing. People slept late. People changed routines. She went to school and taught her classes with the focused professionalism of a woman who had been raised to honor commitments, regardless of personal weather. And she came home in the afternoon and knocked on his door. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. She stood in the lobby with her hand still raised and felt the first real thread of something colder than hurt move through her. She went upstairs and looked at her phone and saw no messages and told herself, "Give it today. Give it today and tomorrow and then decide what to do." She gave it today. She gave it tomorrow. On the 3rd day, she came downstairs and found the building's front door unlocked in the middle of the afternoon, which it never was, and Ethan's apartment door slightly open. and she pushed it carefully and looked inside, and felt her heart drop clean through the floor. The apartment was being emptied. Not completely, not furniture, not the fixtures, but the personal things were going. The bookshelf was half bare, the shelves holding only the books that had clearly come with the building. The kitchen counter that usually held his specific, organized arrangement of things. The small wooden utensil holder, the particular brand of coffee he used. The ceramic mug she had given him as a joke that said, "World's most intense landlord," was cleared. Against the wall, near the entrance, were 2 suitcases, packed, standing upright. Naomi stood in the doorway of his apartment and looked at those suitcases and felt something rise in her chest that was not sadness and not anger, but something older and more urgent than both. The specific feeling of watching something irreplaceable move toward an edge. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps from the back room, and then he appeared in the hallway of his own apartment and stopped when he saw her. He was holding a folded jacket. He looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes found her face and then moved away immediately, which told her everything, because Ethan never looked away from things. "You're leaving," she said. "Now, not in 3 weeks." He set the jacket carefully on top of one of the suitcases. "I moved the flight up," he said. "There's a preliminary meeting next week. It made sense to—" "Ethan." Her voice came out quiet and very clear. "Don't tell me about the meeting." He was silent. "Look at me," she said. He looked at her, and there it was. Everything he had been trying to pack away, along with the coffee and the ceramic mug and the particular architecture of the life he had built here, all of it. Right there in his face, uncontained, undeniable, the longing and the terror of it. The specific fear of a man who had learned that the cost of staying was always, eventually, loss. "I can't do this," he said, and she heard it. The real thing underneath the words, the thing he actually meant, which was not, "I can't do this, but I don't know how to do this without it destroying me when it ends." "You're not even going to try," she said. "Naomi. You are going to pack those suitcases and get on a plane and go back to New York, and you are going to spend the next however many years being very successful and very alone and telling yourself that was the right decision." Her voice didn't shake. She was grateful for that. "And maybe it will be fine. Maybe you'll be fine. But I need you to look at me right now and tell me honestly. Not the version you've been telling yourself, the real version. Tell me that you feel nothing. Tell me that what happened in this building, in these 4 months, means nothing to you." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. He couldn't say it. She could see him trying, could see him reaching for the composure, for the distance, for the careful, controlled surface that had served him for 4 years since Ji-on. And she could see it failing. His jaw tightened. His hands were very still at his sides. His eyes were doing what they did in the rain, what they did every time she caught him being human, saying the thing his voice was refusing to authorize. "I have to go," he said finally. A defeat dressed as a decision. He picked up both suitcases, and Naomi stepped back and let him, because she understood, in that moment, the difference between fighting for someone and fighting at them. And she understood that she had said what needed to be said, and that the rest had to come from him or it meant nothing at all. She went upstairs. She sat at her kitchen table. She did not cry this time. She sat very still and listened to the sounds of him leaving, the front door, the street outside, the eventual silence of a building with one fewer person in it. And she felt the particular hollowness of an absence so recent it still had warmth. Her phone buzzed. "Amara, how are you?" She stared at the message for a long time and then typed, "He's gone," then deleted it, then typed, "I'm okay," then deleted that too. She put the phone face down on the table and sat with her hands folded and thought. This is what it is. Sometimes you see a person clearly, and they cannot yet see themselves, and there is nothing you can do about the distance between those two things. Sometimes love is not enough to make someone brave. She believed that. She almost stayed seated. What moved her was not a dramatic realization. It wasn't a single thought that broke through and changed everything. It was smaller than that. It was the memory of his face in the doorway of her apartment when she was sick, the soup on the nightstand, the specific way he had said her name for the first time, Naomi, like the word itself was something he had been keeping careful and was now letting out. It was the laugh like a window opening. It was a persimmon outside her door. It was his voice in the rain, saying I was checking if you were out here with the specific devastation of a man confessing more than he intended. It was the knowledge, absolute and unshakable, that Kim Ethan was not a man who felt nothing. He was a man who felt everything and had spent 4 years building walls high enough that the feeling couldn't reach him. And she had spent 4 months watching those walls come down, brick by careful brick, and she was absolutely not, going to sit at this table and let him brick them back up around himself on an airplane to New York. She grabbed her bag, her keys, and her phone, and she ran. The subway to Incheon took 58 minutes. She ran to the station. She stood on the platform, breathing hard and willing the train to move faster, and checked flight times on her phone, with shaking hands, and calculated and recalculated, and told herself she had time. She had enough time. She just had to get there. She got there. And that was where the story had begun. Her lungs burning, her sneakers on the polished airport floor, her braids flying, her carry-on abandoned somewhere behind her, the departures board above her, flashing its final boarding notice for Seoul Incheon to New York JFK, and the back of his head, that familiar dark hair, those broad shoulders, moving through the crowd ahead of her. "Ethan!" she screamed. "Kim Ethan, don't you dare!" He didn't turn around. She ran faster. "Ethan, stop! Please!" He stopped. He turned, and she slowed to a halt in front of him, breathing so hard her vision was slightly unsteady, and he looked at her. Really, looked at her. The full, unguarded look he only gave her when he forgot to be careful. And his expression was the most complicated thing she had ever seen on a human face. Relief and anguish and something that looked terrifyingly close to hope. "You weren't supposed to find out," he said. "You weren't supposed to leave," she said back. "Naomi." Her name in his voice was rough at the edges, like it had been held too long. "I have to go. The flight." "Then miss it," she said. He stared at her. "Miss the flight, Ethan. Miss the meeting. Miss all of it." She stepped closer. Close enough that she had to look up at him. Close enough to see the exhaustion in his face. The 4 sleepless years of it. The specific grief of a person who has lost so much they have started to believe. Losing is the only outcome worth preparing for. "I am not Jiyeon," she said softly. "I am not going anywhere. I am standing in an airport at—" She glanced wildly at the departures board. "At 4:47 in the afternoon, having run the entire length of this terminal, to tell you that what you are about to do is a mistake. And I need you to hear me." "You don't know that it's a mistake," he said. "You don't know what happens. Nobody knows what happens." "You're right," she said. "Nobody knows. That's the whole terrifying point of it." She reached out and put her hand over his. Right there in the middle of Incheon International Airport, with the crowds moving around them like a river. His hand was cold. She held it anyway. "But I know that I have spent 4 months watching you be the most careful, most controlled, most thoroughly defended person I have ever met in my life. And I have also watched you make me soup when I was sick and leave a persimmon outside my door and laugh in my kitchen, like you hadn't laughed in years. And I know which version of you is the real one." She tightened her hand around his. "Don't go back to New York and become the other version again. Please." His eyes were very bright. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and his voice had shed the last of its composure entirely. Raw and honest in a way she had only heard from him once before, in the fever-warm light of her bedroom talking about Jiyeon. "I don't know how to. I'm not good at this, Naomi. I don't know how to stay and not—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't know how to love something without being terrified of losing it." Nobody does, she said. That's not a disqualification. That's just what love is. He looked at her. She looked at him. Stay, she said simply. Just stay. The departure board above them changed. Gate 47, closed. Neither of them looked at it. What happened next was very quiet for something so significant. He turned his hand over under hers and held it, properly held it with the intentionality of a man making a decision. And he let out a long breath, like something he'd been carrying for 4 years was being gently set down on the airport floor. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they were clear in a way she hadn't seen before, like weather breaking. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. Naomi felt the word move through her entire body. Okay, she said back. They walked out of Incheon International Airport together in the late afternoon light, his carry-on in one hand and her hand in the other, and the city waited for them the way cities do, indifferent and enormous and full of streets that lead back to the places you actually belong. In the weeks that followed, spring settled fully into Seoul, and the trees on their street went from green to extravagantly, overwhelmingly green. And Naomi moved her books to the shelf in his apartment, because he had more space and she had more books, which seemed like a reasonable arrangement for two people who were figuring out, carefully, and then suddenly, and then completely, what it meant to choose each other. He cooked for her on Tuesday nights, the real things, the things his mother had taught him, the myeokguk and the doenjang jjigae and the japchae that took 45 minutes and was always worth it. She cooked for him on weekends, jollof rice and degusi and puff-puff that he ate with the composed expression of a man who had decided that pretending not to love West African food was no longer an investment worth making. They stood in the kitchen together in the specific, comfortable way of two people who have learned each other's rhythms, who moves left and who moves right, who handles the heat and who handles the timing, the small choreography of two lives, negotiating shared space. She heard him laugh often now, not the surprised, reluctant laugh of the early months, the full one, real and unguarded, the kind that meant he had stopped monitoring himself. She heard him talk about Jiyeon too, sometimes in the evenings when the light was right and the city was quiet. Stories, not just the fact of her. What she was like, how she laughed, what she used to say. He talked about her the way people talk about the dead when they have finally made peace with missing them, with love that has stopped being only grief and started being also gratitude. He called the New York firm and declined the position. He told Naomi about it afterward, quietly, over coffee on the balcony. She didn't make a big thing of it because she knew him well enough to know that the things that mattered most to him didn't want to be made a big thing of. She just reached over and put her hand over his the same way she had in the airport, and he turned his hand over and held it the same way he had, and they sat in the warm morning and watched Seoul wake up below them and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The building felt different now, fuller somehow, even though nothing structural had changed. The neighbors on the 3rd and 4th floors had noticed it too, she thought, the way buildings notice things. The sounds of two people living rather than one, the smell of two kitchens operating in concert, the lights on in both apartments on the evenings they spent apart, which were fewer and fewer as the months went on. One evening in June, warm enough to have the balcony door open, Naomi was sitting at his kitchen table, grading papers while he worked on architectural drawings at the other end, and the silence between them was the very best kind. The kind that isn't the absence of connection, but the presence of it so established and so comfortable that it doesn't need sound to prove it exists. She looked up at him without meaning to, the way you look at things you love when you're not paying attention to yourself. He was already looking at her. "What?" she said. He shook his head slightly. Something in his expression, warm and certain and very quiet. The expression of a man who has stopped being afraid of what he feels. "Nothing," he said. "Just this. Just this." Naomi looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who had opened his door with no smile and a list of rules and the loneliness of 4 years of grief built into every line of him. This man who had made her soup and left her fruit and stood in the rain because he was checking if she was there. And she thought, this is what it looks like when someone decides to stay. Not the airport moment, not the confession, not the dramatic turnaround in the crowd. This. The Tuesday evenings and the shared kitchen and the silence that doesn't need anything added to it. This was the real thing. She smiled at him. He smiled back, full and unguarded, the window-opening kind, and went back to his drawings. Naomi looked down at her papers and thought of what her mother always said, in that particular tone that meant she was being wise and also insufferably correct about something. The love that lasts is the love that chooses ordinary days. Outside, soul did what soul always did, moved and lit and hummed and went on. And inside the building on the quiet side street in Mapogu, between the convenience store and the laundry shop, in an apartment with wooden floors and a small balcony and a bookshelf that held 2 people's worth of stories. Something that had started with a listing and a list of rules and a bowl of jollof rice had become, quietly, and then completely, and then permanently, home. Some love stories begin with grand gestures. This one began with a list of rules and a bowl of jollof rice, and a man who hadn't laughed in years. And it ended, not with fireworks, not with a declaration in the rain, but with 2 people sitting across a kitchen table, in comfortable silence, choosing each other in the quietest, most permanent way. That's the one that lasts. The ordinary day kind, the staying kind. Before you go, tell me where you're watching from. I do this every video, and every time the comments fill up with cities from every continent, and it never stops being the most beautiful thing. Drop your location below. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe, turn on your notifications, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to believe right now that the right person stays. I will see you in the next story.